All right, I want to wrap up our discussion of Mexico and institutions and move on to political parties. So Mexico is a multi-party state since the end of PRI, the single dominant party domination in 2000. So the primary parties are PRI still, the PAN, the PRD, and of course we can't talk about political parties in Mexico in 2019, 2020 without talking about Morena. So first the PRI, because this is the oldest political party in Mexico and certainly had been the dominant. So the PRI, translated, that's the Institutional Revolutionary Party, founded by, as we talked about, by a coalition of elites trying to bring together different groups of people, share power to some extent, extensive use of trading favors for power from one to another. Ruled as a one-party system, ruled Mexico as a one-party system until 2000, lost power gradually from 2000 to 2012, briefly regained the presidency in the election of 2012, and then as we saw in the election of 2018, the PRI did not gain the presidency. So the PRI has a corporatist structure, and if you remember from our reading, corporatist structure, interest groups are woven into the structure of the party. The party is not necessarily democratic in how it runs, but it allowed input into the government from party-selected groups, so very close ties with the corporate world, and also brought competing elites, economic elites primarily, into the cabinet as part of the government. The party is also characterized by a patron-client system. A lot of its support still comes from the rural areas, and that support in return for favors still exists in that part of the country. The PRI still, again, relatively appeals to the rural population, so residents of the South, which is more rural in nature, those that are less educated, those that are older, and those that are less well off economically. Second is the PAN, or the PAN Party, the National Action Party in translation. Ideologically, this is to the right of the PRI, so a little more conservative, created to represent primarily business interests, advocates more regional autonomy, so more power to the regions, less from the federal government, also less government intervention in the economy and how the economy works. It has a pretty good communication and relationship with the Catholic Church. Its strengths in terms of regions are in the north. And again, remember, in the north, a little more economically strong, a little more economically successful. The PAN appeals to the increasing middle class, and we've certainly seen the middle class growing in the 2000s. An urban support with the increase in the urban population as well. Those with a higher level of education, and also because of that good relationship with the Catholic Church to religious patrons as well. The PAN didn't, when it first was formed, did not have a great impact. It took a long time for it to have a significant presence, but once in the 1990s, it began to win a few governor's races. All right, third is the PRD, or translated the Democratic Revolutionary Party. Ideologically, these are to the left of the PRI. It split off from the PRI. The leaders were originally part of the PRI, but it has historically, in its short history, suffered from internal division and conflict, and as we'll see, the Morena breaks away from the PRD as well. A lack of focus, hasn't won a presidency since its origins. They wanted to focus more on reform and social justice. Those that support the PRD primarily come from the younger generations, and again, that's going to be what Morena is appealing to as well. Those that are politically active, those from the central states in terms of regions, those with some education, small town or urban, so not necessarily distinguishing between those two. They have drawn some support from the middle class and from older voters beginning in 2006. But again, not significant success from the PRD. And again, we can't talk about political parties without mentioning Morena, who's really come on strong in the last election. So Morena, the National Regeneration Movement, it is basically broken away from the PRD, founded in 2014, led by AMLO, so led by the current president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. Describes itself as democratically left-wing, supports ethnic, religious, cultural, and sexual diversity, respect for human rights, and care for the environment. And it's still relatively early to see what their long-term support, where it's going to come from, but a lot of it in the 2018 election came from the younger generation and those that are politically active. In terms of women in parliament, this is just a quick chart. 2012 here was the most recent I could find that had Mexico in it, but relative to other industrialized powers, just over 25% as a proportion of the total for women. So not terrible, but not great. Certainly a little bit above the world average, as you can see. In terms of governor's races, with respect to the political parties, and again, this is going back a little bit, but you can see the trend here of the PRI beginning to, well, actually not holding all of the governor's positions, but you can see in the South we've had some PRD governorships and the PAN in the central and a little bit in the western part of the country. Violence in politics has been an issue in Mexico as well, partially related to the drug trade. So here you can see from 2003 to 2010, those municipalities that have had a mayor assassinated, and some with multiple mayors assassinated. So something you have to factor into the politics in Mexico. All right, electoral reforms. Created an electoral commission to regulate campaigns and elections in 1990. We talked about a little bit about that in an earlier discussion. All parties receive government funding. All parties now have access to the media, which they didn't necessarily have before when it was PRI controlled. Other reforms increasing the number of Senate seats from 68 to 128. That comes in 1993. You can see as these changes are happening in the 1990s how this sort of represents that transitional democracy that we've talked about. Making legal the presence of foreign electoral observers. So foreign election observers can come in and guarantee, certify that an election is legitimate, that there's no fraud that's happening. That was in 1994. They also created an election institute, an election commission, the Federal Election Institute in 1996, and then replaced that a little bit later in the 2000s, 2013, with the Institut Nacional Electoral. So this is very similar to our FEC, our Federal Election Commission we have in the United States. There also was a reform in 1996 that limits the number of seats that one party can hold in the Chamber of Deputies to 60%. Again, trying to guarantee that there is some minority representation. So the maximum is 300 of the 500 seats. All right, also in 1996, proportional representation was incorporated into senatorial elections for 32 of the 128 seats. We mentioned that in the first part of this presentation as well. Also, in terms of electoral reforms, a limit was set on the amount that a party can spend for a campaign. Also set for that proportional representation, the bottom threshold, where a party has to have at least 2% support both in the Senate and in the Chamber of Deputies. That comes in 1996. Also, priests were legally allowed to cast votes. In 1996, also passed legislation that recommended, and initially it was a recommendation, that parties establish a gender quota for their candidate list, so a certain percentage of female candidates. In 2002, that law was changed to require that 40% of the congressional ballot for each party be made up of women. So here you can see the results of the 2018 election. Again, historic win for Morena. Fairly successful for the PAN, not so great for the PRD or the PRI. The presidential vote results, you can see that all but one of the states goes for AMLO. So he gets 53.2% of the vote. And again, rather disappointing showing for the PRI candidate and for the PAN PRD candidate. All right, in terms of the Chamber of Deputies, the colors are a little bit tough to see here, but you can see for Morena, 37.8%. And on the right-hand side, if you look at that chart, for the party composition, the bottom left is orange, and it moves to the Morena color in the red. It's not, initially it might look like more than 50% for Morena, but there's orange or a shade of orange before you get to the red. The one on the left is showing the alliances, and again, alliances are extremely important in Mexican politics, and sometimes you have alliances that go across ideologies. Morena was allied in the election with a party that was very conservative on the right, and certainly not necessarily consistent with all of the issues that Morena would support. So unusual alliances can happen in Mexican politics. Okay, the media. Under the period of time when the PRI dominated, the media was government run. It was controlled by the PRI, so it was their message that got out. Opposition parties, opposition interests didn't have much of a vote or much of a voice because it was controlled by the PRI. The last PRI president, Nieto, increased the budgets to the news media organization. There's a link there that talks a little bit about that in 2017. The media has gained independence since the 1980s. Certainly technology has something to do with that. Access to satellite TV, they can get their message out there a little bit more. It's significantly more open today. There's still some issues regarding the media and investigative journalism in Mexico. Again, there's a history, a legacy of corruption, and sometimes when investigative journalists go a little bit too far, there's significant pushback, and sometimes that happens outside the law. So some continuing pressure from corporate and government forces as a result. The Freedom House ratings, as you see there, the most recent from 2019, Mexico scores a 62, which is not that great. There's a link there. You can check out how that compares with the rest of the region and the other AP6. All right, that wraps up institutions.